What is up guys, Julien here of Social Vignerons. Welcome back to another wine video. This is episode 14 of the Talking Wine with Julien series, the series where we together learn several times a week about a particular wine related topic. I share the knowledge that I have as a winemaker and I research a topic and I share what I've learned doing the research, so you can just sit at home and enjoy learning about wine every day or several times a week with me, and we learn together. So today we are going to be looking at the 1855 classification of the wines of Bordeaux, of the wines of Medoc, so that's on the left bank. I am going to give you my 5 top interesting facts about the 1855 classification, so we understand a bit more where it comes from, what it is all about, and at the end of the video, after my top 5 facts, I will consider what it means for the wines of Bordeaux of today. Let's go! So top interesting fact number 1, the 1855 classification wasn't the first classification of the wines of Bordeaux. In fact, there was a very significant, interesting classification done in 1787 by Thomas Jefferson, yes, the 3rd president of the United States. That's before he became president. He was president between 1801 and 1809, but before that he already loved France and French wine, so he visited in 1787 and he already had classified, and he wrote down all the best wineries, classifying them in 3 levels already. What's interesting though is that the top 4 wineries that he listed were Chateau Margaux, Chateau de Lafite, which is known today as Lafite Rothschild, Chateau Aubryon, and Chateau de la Tour Ségur, which is now known as Chateau Latour up in Pauillac. So interestingly, all the top estates except for Chateau Mouton Rothschild, and we'll get back to this in a moment, all the top estates were already identified 70 years or so before the 1855 classification as some of the top estates, and that says something about how long the Bordeaux wines have been good and recognized for their excellence in the world of wine. Interesting fact number 2, how did the 1855 classification come about at that time? Essentially, Emperor Napoleon III was hosting in Paris the Exposition Universelle, so the Universal Exposition, or also known as the World's Fair, in Paris in 1855, and he wanted to showcase the best wines from France to all the people that would come from all around the world and all around Europe. He wanted to showcase the best wines, so he asked the Chamber of Commerce of Bordeaux to find and list all the best estates so he could present the best wines from Bordeaux. For those who aren't very familiar with the Exposition Universelle, know that there was another very famous Exposition Universelle hosted in Paris in 1889, and that's exactly when the Eiffel Tower was erected for the Exposition Universelle. So very significant event at the time. Getting back to our subject, the Chamber of Commerce then asked the negociants and the trade of Bordeaux to come up with the list, and that leads us to the 3rd interesting fact. How was the list made, and how were the chateaux ranked? So fact number 3 you should know about the 1855 classification. How were the Bordeaux wines and the chateau classified in it? Well, the trade, we know now that the trade did the classification well. They essentially took what they had on hand, and essentially they took the market price of the different estates and the different wineries at the time. And I'm gonna have to read this to you, but the first gross were essentially wines priced over 3,000 francs. The second gross were between 2,500 and 300, and the third gross were between 2,100 and 2,500. etc., etc. So just going down prices. They also said that they included elements of the reputation and the quality of the wine, but this wasn't really disclosed, or there wasn't like a sophisticated algorithm to do that. Essentially, they took the prices. So in the end, they classified 61 different chateaux in the Médoc, 5 premiers crus, 14 deuxième crus, 14 troisième crus, so third crus, 10 fourth crus, quatrième crus, and 18 cinquième crus. Interestingly, and that's our point number 4, there has only been 3 changes made to the classification since it was first made in 1855. The first one was the year just after 1856. They realized that they had omitted one important chateau, Chateau Cantemerle, and so they just added it in the year after 1856. The second change happened about 15-20 years later, when the Chateau Dubignon in Margaux, so that's in the 1870s, became the Chateau Malescaut Saint-Exupéry that we know today. So they just amended a little bit the classification around this at that time. And then we had to wait for about 100 years before any other change was done. This takes us to 1873, when obviously, as we know, Chateau Mouton Rothschild was added to the classification, and that's after a lot of lobbying from the Rothschild family, or I think that's what I understood from the history. After a lot of lobbying and a change of presidency in France, President Georges Pompidou said, okay, well, let's add Mouton Rothschild to please my friend into the top chateaus, and they came right into as the first crus together with the Lafite, the Margaux, and the Latour and the Haut-Brion right at the top. And then you may be wondering, but why didn't the wines from the right bank, the great wines that we know today from Pomerol, from Saint-Emilion, Fronsac and the Libournais area in general, the great Merlot-based wines we know today, why weren't they classified and included in the 1855 classification? Well, rather simply, at the time, those wines weren't traded by the negociants of Bordeaux. So when they listed the wines, they didn't include them. They weren't that expensive, they weren't that famous, they weren't that exported, they weren't that renowned. So they just simply didn't consider them at the time for inclusion and presentation at the Exposition Universelle. It has to be noted as well that the 1855 classification ranked some of the wines of the Graves, so that's the more southern part of the left bank of Bordeaux, south of Médoc. Those were listed, the wines of Sauternes and the wines of Barsac. But I will make separate videos about the classification of Saint-Emilion in particular. The last one was updated in 2012, so Saint-Emilion has updated over time its classification, so I will run a separate video on that. And I will also run a separate video on the wines of Sauternes and Barsac, the Botrytis sweet wines from the south of Bordeaux, and the classification of the Graves, the white and the red wines of the Graves. So separate video, make sure to stay tuned for this on the channel. And that was my point number 5. But now that we know a little bit more about the classification itself and the context at the time and what the classification contained, now it's time to discuss what it actually means for the wines of today. Essentially, there are quite a few things to note about what the 1855 classification means for today. If those wines were classified and they were already excellent at the time in the middle of the 19th century, all those chateaux, even though they had really no idea compared to what we know today about what they were doing with the wines, there was no wine science at the time. They didn't control all the making of the barrels, the infusion of oak. I think they used to mix and blend the red grapes with the white grapes. Then the phylloxera kick in at the time or a little bit later. they really had not much of a clue exactly what they were doing, but at the time still they were making fantastic wines that they were able to ship to England, to the United States, all across Europe, and those wines were already considered some of the finest wines at the time, meaning that all those chateaux are on a spectacular terroir, because the grapes were just coming out of the ground, fantastic wines without any knowledge of winemaking or any control over exactly how to produce great wine. Now everyone controls how we can produce fantastic wine. The difference now that what we're looking for are those great terroirs, but at the time those chateaux were exactly on the right spots, the right subsoils to produce virtually by themselves fantastic wines. And those terroirs where those chateaux are still are some of the best terroirs in Bordeaux, and it's almost impossible to beat the best terroir even with the best winemaking. So those chateaux are still some of the best. On top of that, because they were classified in 1855, they've had 170 years of cashing in, if I may say, of selling their wine at a higher price than anyone else. So they've been able to invest into their vineyards, into their winemaking facilities, into knowledgeable people, into gathering more and more information about their terroir. And so they've had 150 years lead on everyone else. So those wines, those chateaux are still fantastic today because they've had more means to develop better wine and make even better and better wine, which leads us to also the differentiation, and that's very important, that's happened especially in the Medoc between the small producers that were not classified in 1855 and all the other ones, because the big ones have had so much money selling their wine to the trade and all around the world extremely well with large margins and selling en primeur, which means that they sell the wine 2 years before they actually release the bottle. So cash machine and cash machine. They have been able to purchase other vineyards in great location in the Medoc from smaller vignerons, smaller producers that died out by, you know, with just the generations going one after the other, the old man, you know, passing away and having to give away his vineyards. So they've been able to purchase all the vineyards. What happens in the 1855 classification is that not the terroirs are not classified, but just the brands, the chateau name. So if they buy different vineyards, they can include them into the wines, and they can still call it a Grand Cru Classé or being classified for those wines. So that's made a big difference. Locally, some smaller vignerons getting poorer and struggling selling their wines, while the biggest are getting bigger and bigger and getting more and more money. Overall, I think the classified vineyards, or the vineyards of the classified groves, have expanded quite a bit. My research shown that they went from 2,600 hectares to 3,500 hectares. So they have expanded, but not massively, but they have expanded. And so the vineyards have changed since the 1855 classification for most chateaux. One notable exception, and I worked for them, is Chateau du Tertre in Margaux, which is virtually one single block, and I've got a video about this, I'll link around here. One single block that hasn't virtually changed all that much, but all the others have changed a little bit their vineyards. One notable thing as well is that at the time they were only making pretty much one Grand Vin in 1855, one first wine, all these chateaux. Now most separate their wines with a first vin, first wine, and a second label where they put a bit of the younger wines and the lower quality terroirs. So at the time they were a bit smaller estates, but they would put everything into the same wine. While now they're bigger vineyards, but they have different labels that allows them to separate and bring the quality higher and higher year on year. That said, the ranking between the first grove, second grove, third grove, fourth groves and fifth groves, the ranking is not completely still valid. There are examples of, for example, Pontet Canet, which is a fifth grove, that sells at much higher price than some second grows. Chateau Palmer is a second gross, but it's reaching levels getting towards the first gross, and at least towards the second gross. You've got some Montrose and Cos d'Estournel in Saint-Estèphe that are super seconds. Some of the seconds are so good. They are one step above all the others. They are called the super seconds. So the lines have moved a little bit between the categories, between those that have been investing and learning their terroir really well for years and years and decades, and those that have fallen a little bit behind for one reason and another. So the ranking itself doesn't exactly represent the absolute quality of the classification at the time. And now it's time to ask you to get a little bit involved and give me your information. I've just given what I had to say about this. Give me your information. What do you think of the 1855 classification? Do you think it's good? Do you think it's rubbish? Do you think it should be updated? Do you think it should be redone like they did in Saint-Emilion? And should they upgrade some chateaus and others? Which ones? What are your favorite 1855 chateaus? Mine is always going to be Chateau Margaux. I worked at Chateau Margaux. As you can probably tell, I worked at Chateau Margaux back in 2003, but I've also worked at Chateau Giscourt at some point. So I've got a few favorites here and there, but I'd love to hear which ones are yours and which ones I should really try. I am going to be reviewing more and more Grand Cru Classés of Bordeaux, so make sure to subscribe to the channel and check out my Tasting with Julien series. And I think that was me for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you've learned something. I will continue researching wine and sharing my knowledge. So come along with the journey. Subscribe to the channel. Give me some love and like this video here or here. It only takes 1 second, but it helps me quite a lot. And I will see you soon. We will continue learning together about wine. I will see you soon in the world of wine. Cheers.